Welcome back, everyone. We now have our last panel of the day where we're going to summarize and wrap up a day full of ideas and information and talk about some next steps. To moderate our panel is Chris Hill, Professor of Public Policy and Technology and Director of the Doctoral Program in Public Policy at George Mason School of Public Policy. Dr. Hill?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you all very much. And a special thanks go to those of you who endured the entire day and have remained with us. And of course, as speakers, moderators here, panelists, we very much appreciate your diligence in staying through. I thought what we would do is I would, of course, can't refrain from making a few general observations of my own. And then I'm going to turn to the three panelists who are already known to you because they've been the moderators of the previous sessions, and ask them to cut to the chase and go to the question, essentially, what must we do? What are the public policy directions that we should follow based on what we've heard here today? And of course, each of them brings great depth of experience and knowledge and wisdom to that question beyond what they heard today. Let me make some general observations on today's discussion from my perspective. The first observation I would make is a general consensus that there's a great need for action, for change, for new direction, excuse me, for resources to improve the economy, to improve our quality of life, and regardless of how we unravel the struggle of what competitiveness might actually mean in practice, or at least what it means in theory, I think we understand intuitively what it means in practice, that the country needs to do a better job than it's doing. But there's also a great sense in the room today of possibility, that we can do things, that we can move forward. I was struck by the fact, and maybe I've been in Washington too long, but I was struck by the fact that in my hearing, no one today has risen to ask the question, what is the appropriate federal role? That question has stuck us dead still in the water for decades. It's a question that stops all debate and gets all discussion about what we must do relocated into a philosophical domain of unresolvable Thomistic arguments about the nature of democracy, the nature of freedom, the nature of markets, and takes us away from America's strongest point, which is our ability to do things, to get things done. And so I have the feeling that there is a new feeling in the air. There is a new sense in the United States, in America, both of great challenge, deep challenge to our country, but of real possibility that we can do something, which has always been America's great strength. The sense that we can take action. Now, in the conversation, there has also been, I think, a considerable dominance of the, particularly in the policy-oriented presentations of this morning and some running through the day, a dominance of two kinds of questions. How much, meaning how much money, and by the way, we need more, and by the way, I should get it, or my institution, or my field, or my industry, or my sector, or my labs, or my universities. And there's a corollary question of how many. Do we have enough? Do we have enough engineers? Do we have enough scientists? Do we have enough kids in STEM? And these kind of quantitative questions of how much and how many, in a way, are easy to answer, at least in principle, because it's easy to say, well, of course, with all due respect to one of the previous panelists, fully fund competes. That's a how much question. Or let's get more kids in K-12 in math and science, a kind of how many question. The Competes Act itself embodies this how much and how many philosophy of dealing with the competitiveness challenge, the innovation challenge the country faces. But I would suggest that this afternoon's conversations, which emphasize practitioners, have a different flavor. They ask, what kind of people do we need? And what kinds of projects and activities should we be doing? And they ask, how best can we get them done? Should we partner? Can we globalize? Do we outsource? Can we engage in open innovation. Those are, at first order, not questions about how much, but about how. How do we do these things? What kinds of projects? This got less attention today, but Deborah Wince-Smith was especially powerful, I thought, in arguing for a broader conception of what the subject of the meeting is about. What is innovation? How broadly must we reconceive of innovation as an activity involving the service sector, the arts, the humanities, culture, business models, new ways of doing things, and there was a lot of that in the P&G presentation over lunch. So the reason partnerships, then, it seems to me, looms large is that it has played such a great role, not just this year, but for 25 years in the national conversation about how best to deploy the resources that we actually have available to us. And it's through partnering. Not a new idea. I had the pleasure as a young faculty member of joining a materials research laboratory in 1970, funded by DARPA, collaborative between Monsanto Corporation and Washington University, a classic government, industry, university three-way partnership with the Office of Naval Research involved. From that, Monsanto learned how to partner, and Monsanto built its enormous life sciences laboratories with Washington University, changed that company. That's not a new idea, but it's an idea that, of course, had great flowering in the 80s. As someone suggested before, Larry Sumney's organization, I think, dates in 1982. Eric Bloch was central to getting that started. Eric went to NSF and started the Engineering Research Centers program and built up the whole culture of partnerships that we now talk about. But I would characterize this overall trend from how much and how many to what kind and how as a shift of a debate from a purely quantitative conversation about budgets and attendance roles to a qualitative discussion about the nature of what we do. And this suggests something to me about where the next round of public policy debate needs to go. Indeed, funding the Competes Act programs is probably not a bad idea. It's probably a good idea. We probably ought to do that. But we need to move beyond that. And in this sense, I am personally quite frustrated by the litany of conversation that came from some of the leaders here this morning, that there's no room right now for good ideas or new ideas. What we have to do is get the appropriation for the Competes Act. That was the right thing to say before the election. It's the wrong thing to say now. And we have to begin to think beyond, it seems to me, that. We do need to search and consider new ideas. This innovation discussion began not last year, but in the 1960s with the Sharpe report on technological innovation, its management and technology innovation and management. There was major legislation in the 1980s that we all live with, Bayh-Dole, Federal Tech Transfer Act, National Cooperative Research Act, and so on, that set a legislative framework for what we all are interested in doing, and we've not done very much since that time. My guess is that it's time. It's time for a reexamination, a review, a renewal, and a strengthening of the national policy framework for innovation and competitiveness. That's going to be a framework based on not so much how much and how many, but what kind. What kinds of education will be necessary for the successful innovator in the future? It's not going to be the kind of engineering education that I had or the kind of management education that perhaps maybe others had, for example. So I hope our panelists will begin to set and train here this afternoon a national conversation about what we must do. And for that, I want to turn first to Bill Wulf, who, of any of us, has more experience probably than maybe, except maybe for me. I'm not sure, Bill. But tell us what we must do.
Well, first let me comment that workshops do not proceed in a nice linear fashion. We have been all over different parts of this problem at various times during the day. So what I tried to do is just write down a list of some of the things that we talked about and put them in kind of a linear fashion, in a this implies that, implies that, implies the next thing. And my list is not terribly long. And it starts, in fact, with exactly what Chris started for. There's a recognition of the need. In particular, we had a conversation about whether we were techno-nationalists or not. I was in, I think I mentioned this morning, I was in a meeting in Berlin with the von Humboldt Foundation talking about this very issue, except the focus was on Europe, and Germany in particular, as opposed to the U.S. And they kept using the word win. How is Germany going to win? And I finally got up and said, this is not something you win. You might be in the lead at some particular time, but the game doesn't ever end. And so you never win. What you want to make sure of is that you don't lose. Okay, and I think that's the real message we ought to portray. We want to live in a healthy, prosperous, secure country. And we're only going to do that if we are in the game. Okay? So we start with need. I think the second thing is urgency. I think we all, again, this came up any number of times during the day today and in my meeting in Berlin. We've been talking about this problem since 1960-ish. Certainly, I think everybody in this room feels a certain amount of frustration that, for example, Competes hasn't been funded yet, that other places are moving out on this agenda, and we seem to have one more workshop to talk about it. And the people in the workshop are mostly those people who already agree with each other about most of this stuff. So need, urgency. Third, again, this came up many, many times during the day in different ways, but we have evidence that this notion of partnerships can amplify the effectiveness of the participants. We also have some examples where it doesn't. And so from those two, as in tech transfer at most universities, for example, so we can, or at least in principle, we ought to be able to extract the properties of those things that work and those that don't. The very last panel, I thought, generated a really nice list of commitment, critical size, focus on the outcome. All the participants must win. If any of the participants doesn't win, the whole thing won't work. I don't know whether that's the complete list, but it's certainly a place to start, and one could build an argument for what those properties are. So we can build a list of properties for success. And then my last thing was, and this, again, came up over and over again in different ways, but I think we all recognize that we're going to have to build incentives in somehow to get things to happen. Universities may recognize that in principle it's good for the country for them to partner with industry, national laboratories, but unless there are tangible incentives, it's not going to happen. Okay? And the most obvious tangible incentive is money. You can think about whether there are some others as well, but we have to recognize this is going to cost money. And it's not going to work unless everybody is a willing partner. You can't do it with sticks. You've got to do it with carrots. So that was my short list. Tried to put it in some kind of a linear order, and I'm done.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to go now in the order in the program and turn to the moderator of Panel 2, Rob Atkinson, who's also has a lot of experience in many different parts of this question of innovation, competitiveness, technology, and this relatively new think tank here in town seems to be turning out another report about every 4 days, each one of which makes path-breaking contributions. So I'm sure that, well, we'll have a lot to tell us.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we have a secret software program that produces these, so press the button. I have an agenda which I want to share, but just before I do that, I guess I would say, to me, the problem is to get to this agenda, you have to go through at least 3 funnels, if you will, or decision gates. And our problem is we're not anywhere near the bottom of those decision gates, so we get hung up. What are those? The first one is there a problem? And, we seem to go back and forth on that. Rising above the gathering storm seemed to convince a lot of people there was a problem, but then you got the RAND report that came out this summer, which we thought was, frankly, not a very valid or accurate report. And it said, what we worry, there's really no problem, U.S. number 1. And then, fundamentally, I think the evidence is very, very clear. We have a problem. We're no longer number 1. We've got a new report coming out in early 2009 that will make that case empirically. The second point is, related to that, is if we have a problem, is define problem. And people just want to define away problem by saying, it's kind of like sports teams saying, the idea of the Celtics winning, Red Auerbach doesn't really believe in winning. It's not really the right way to look at it. We're playing kind of against Red Auerbach. All the other countries are Red Auerbachs, where they're like, we're going to win. And I agree it's not winning. You only win one. You got to win now, next year, next year, next year. You can never win permanently. But you want to win now. And we don't have that sense. And I think it's even made worse by people like, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, he's at Columbia. If you saw Steve Lohr's piece in the New York Times a Sunday ago, Biswati, I guess, he has this very kind of cool and popular, and I'm a contrarian, a book, which is essentially saying that it's all about use of innovation, not production of innovation. Now, there are very few people in Washington who won't argue more strenuously than I am that it's about use of innovation. That's a big part of what we say at ITIF. But we don't at the same time say, production of innovation is useless. The two are critically important. It's how you use innovation through an economy, and it's how you produce innovation. And the fact that we're in this debate in this country where we even have to debate that fundamental point, to me seems we're really missing the whole point. And I said in this article, he's posing a false choice, that somehow it doesn't matter. We'll just have Walmart. This is a wonderfully innovative company. We'll just have Walmart. Intel could go out of business. It doesn't really matter. Walmart will use somebody's chip technology in their computers. I think that's the wrong way. The second thing is, so we acknowledge maybe there's a problem. And I guess I would articulate in related to that, there's a problem, and I define the problem as the U.S. should be the world leader by far. Anything less than that to me is a problem. Now, we're not even the world leader, not even by far. We're not even the world leader anymore. I think that's the problem. Second question is, will the market solve it? And again, I think we get into these vastly unproductive debates. Should it be public or should it be private? You see all the people, it's just about research funding. Don't do R&D tax credits. That's the private sector. Or, no, we should just do R&D tax credits. We don't want to do research funding. And again, we're in this sort of false debate, this false choice. We have to do all of these things together. And this notion somehow that it's the state versus the market, I think, is completely wrong. It's really about how do you combine the best parts of the market, which is where the U.S. leads, with really supportive and intelligent public policies. We heard about the focus centers in the SRC program this morning. To me, that's a perfect example of blending the market and government together in a very smart set of policies. The last point on that is we've been arguing for a while now that the reason it's hard to get beyond that is that the economic doctrines that prevail in Washington, that basically are in the heads of most of the people who are making economic policy in Washington, completely ignore innovation. So if you're a Bob Rubin, if you're a neoclassical economist and you believe that the most important thing to grow the economy is something to do with interest rates, which they do, or the price of inflation, set of inflation, or all of that stuff. If you think that's what's going to grow the economy, you won't even come to these conferences. You won't pay attention to them because that's the science policy ghetto. If you're a Keynesian, which a lot of the people on the left are Keynesians, the main thing you can do to grow the economy is national health care. Now, I'm a complete, total proponent of 100% universal national health care, but it is not an economic policy. It's a social policy. And until we realize, and in our view, what we need is this notion of innovation economics with people like Paul Romer, Darren, I'm really bad at pronouncing, Darren Asagu at MIT, these kinds of people who in the last decade have articulated a case that innovation is not just this thing over at the side, but is the center of economic policy, not something that's inside the black box, as Rosenberg said. I think it's going to be very hard for us to get there. Okay, long way of saying that. What do I think we need to do? I think we need to do 5 things. I would do 5 things. One is, I don't mean to presume in order. Okay, I would fund America Competes. The Competes Act. I would do that. I think that's important. It's critically important. But I would do more. I think we need to go way beyond on the R&D tax credit. I mentioned earlier we were number 1 when Bill Clinton took office. We're 17th now. Other countries, France, if they're still here, they just did a new R&D policy 2 years ago. They are more generous than we are. The Japanese are more generous. The Canadians, the Chinese, the Mexicans, vastly more generous than we are. I would say we should move to a 20% alternative simplified flat credit, 20% alternative ASC, and a 40% collaborative R&D credit. Any R&D a company does with a university, federal lab, or a DOJ-approved consortium should qualify for a 40% flat R&D credit. Third thing I would do would be much more focus on focus centers. So we have, I think there's 2 kinds of focus centers we have. We've got the SRC one, and I think there's one in shipbuilding. So I think this is one of the most effective models we have in spurring R&D and innovation and collaboration. And we have 2 efforts in the entire government that are focused on these kinds of sector-based, collaborative, road mapping kinds of exercises. We should have 25. And I couldn't say which they are. I think industry and people got to come together. I don't think Washington has the capability, or should they pick those, but we need to do a lot more there. Third, I think fourth, we need to engage the states. As Dan Berglund was alluding to, the states are doing many, many interesting things here. We're a big country. Washington can't really reach out to many small and medium-sized enterprises or many sort of second-tier universities who are doing very interesting. You want to really go an interesting program, it's, I don't know what it is, the University of Minnesota Duluth, fascinating natural resource research center. Fascinating work they're doing on taking natural resource R&D and applying it into the Iron Range and developing all sorts of new technologies. That's something that the Fed should be supporting but not running. And the last point, I'll make my plea on STEM. I know it's unpopular to say this. Only about 5 to 7% of Americans are scientists or engineers. I pretend to be one on TV, but I'm not. Most people don't need to be PhD, master's, or BA scientists. What we really should be focusing on, in my view, is how do we get those kids, and we need to expand that to meaning certainly increasing numbers of girls and women and minorities, but how do we get those people who are inclined to do that and get them on that path? And in my view, that means focusing a little more strategically. That's why we called for the expansion of math and science academies. There's 100 math and science academies in high schools in the country now, including Thomas Jefferson. If you're from Washington, you know TJ. But there's 100 of these. They're great. And the report we did on this, it has a lot of the evidence of how good these places are, the percentage rates of going on to getting a BA, a BS, and then masters and PhDs. So we called for quadrupling the number of these in 5 years. I think, to me, that's sort of the best approach. Then you take those programs and you get Sandia, Los Alamos, Dow, and you really build your partnerships around this core. I'll make one last point. That is essentially Singapore's strategy today. Interesting study that just came out on Singapore. Singapore is, I know in our country there are a lot of great strengths, and one of them is that we are a meritocratic country, but sometimes that means that we're going to ignore kids who are really top-notch talented kids because we don't want anybody to be too good. If you know, at TJ recently, they had this thing where they were thinking they would have a program where they would limit the number of Asians that could come to the high school, because Caucasians were not getting enough places. Now, you listen to that. I don't know about you, but I'm shocked. I'm like, you know why the Asians are getting things? Because they work really, really hard.
That's right. And
we're sending a message saying, if you work really, really hard, we're not going to let you into TJ. We're going to let white people, Caucasians, whatever, in there who might not work as hard. And I'm not saying, that whether they do or they don't work hard. But the point is, it should be, we need to have a place where these kids who are really, really talented, whatever race they are, whatever sex they are, to be able to do that. And again, other countries do that, and I think we're missing the boat. So anyway, sorry for going on so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I knew you wouldn't have a thing to say about this.
You were right.
You're just like me. You're so reserved you can't stand it.
Exactly.
But, appreciate it. And finally, I want to turn to Richard Stullen, who, of course, just moderated the previous panel, so he's still remembers what went on in his panel, I'm sure. Richard has a remarkably broad array of responsibilities at Sandia, ranging from collaborations with universities and industry to nuclear weapons programs that he probably couldn't talk about if we forced him to. So please, you get to wrap up here.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I'm not sure I'll wrap up, but let me just add to the discussion. If I sort of stand back from what I heard today and start sort of at the top level, I think, you know, what we talked about today, and under the rubric of sort of competitiveness, because there were lots of topics that sort of crept in, as Bill said, this is not a linear process. It's really about, I think, four things. One is developing our future workforce. And I think of this as from a U.S. perspective. Number one, developing our future workforce. Number two, shoring up our S&T base. And again, I think of this from a national perspective, not a national lab perspective, but really a national perspective. Third, it's about driving the economy through innovation and making this workforce and the S&T base connected and available to the economic sector in appropriate ways. And then lastly, and not leastly, is achieving some important national outcomes. And when I think about those national outcomes, I think about energy. I think about national security. I think about health care. So these partnerships that we talked about have the power to impact in ways, if they're constructed right, significantly in these national outcome areas. So those are the sort of the four sort of high-level points I would make about generally what the discussion was. What to do? Certainly, I think the American Competes Act needs to move forward. I'm troubled when I look at it that it essentially is still sort of a stovepiped approach to competitiveness. You'll see every constituency's fingerprints in the American Competes Act, right? What's missing is the intersections. What's missing are the incentives to have the university and their university fellowships, as you well know, described in the American Competes Act, linked to the economic sector and the national laboratories. So somehow what I would propose is that we have incentives from the government that glue together the stovepipes that are now evident in the American Competes Act. And those are incentives for partnerships. And so what are some of those? Well, my colleagues here have mentioned them already, the obvious ones. First, for industry, R&D tax credits. Imagine expanding that in a way that allows industry to really tap into the national laboratories and the universities in a different way. Easy thing to do, and again, Europe has started to lead the way there. For the laboratories, there could be incentives with regard to the energy frontier research centers that Dr. Kung talked about this morning. Those right now, looking at them, if those could be modeled in a way that they actually would incentivize partnerships, again, with the other sectors, they could be quite powerful. And we have examples of those today with the Joint Bioenergy Institute that was described this morning already. So I think there are ways there to help from a federal laboratory perspective. Other incentives that actually we've had in the past, but lost. We had something called the Tech Transfer Initiative in the early 90s that for some of the faults that it had still produced an incredible amount of intellectual property and creative ideas that we at the national laboratories are still living off of today, quite frankly. And that was a $200 million plus program, Bill, right? So it takes some money to incentivize these things. And for the universities, the fellowships that were talked about again in the Gathering Storm report, if they could be tied to fellowships that are in support of partnerships and consortia, again, it's a way to incentivize. So again, sort of coming back to the gathering storm, fund it, but let's look for ways to glue the pieces together that simply are absent today. Second sort of broad area, I would say, in terms of what should we do now is we heard a lot about what different pieces of the government are doing today. So NSF is doing something, DOE is doing something, NIH is doing something, the states are doing something. We need to glue those pieces together. How do we take a look more comprehensively at the policies and the practices that are occurring across the government and more effectively align them? And that was actually a point brought out, I think, earlier this morning. That's not easy, but I think we're losing some advantages here unless we can actually leverage and glue those together a bit better. So it's congruence of policy, both within the federal government and as it cascades down to the state and local level. And then thirdly, this last panel had a discussion, and I think it also emerged this morning, which is, why are we doing this? What's the purpose here? And so I think there is a need for focus on outcomes. I'll say it once more again. Being real clear what we want these, if we develop focus centers, and I agree with that recommendation, Rob, let's be clear about what are the big deal outcomes that we want those to be addressing for the country. So I think that's it for me, Chris.
Thank you. I'd like to start by posing one question back to the panel, and then I'd like to open it up to the rest of you, and that is to take up this question of outcomes. In fact, as a devotee as I am of the late Edwards Deming, Deming actually discouraged focusing only on outcomes. Deming said if you want to control the outcome, you have to control the process of getting to the outcome. And that means you have to measure everything along the way, but further you have to empower those in the process who are responsible for the execution of the pieces of the process to take responsibility for their process. That suggests to me that we need to look not only at outcomes, but again, at how we're doing what we're doing. If we put, let's say, $25 billion annually into the health-related research activity, as we're currently doing, people are now beginning to ask, yes, but life isn't getting any better. Life expectancy is not growing, disease incidence is not going down. What's wrong with this picture? You guys have to fix what you're doing because the outcomes aren't happening. But what we're not paying attention to, it seems to me, is the innards, the process through which inquiry is transformed into health-related outcomes. And so I'm wondering whether in a way like the Competes Act, which is an over-focus on inputs, if we were to shift to an output sort of driven policy, we would similarly then ignore the processes by which you were getting there. And maybe by outcomes, and Richard, I'm obviously directing this to you, but others in the audience have spoken to it, and I just wonder if that takes us down a similarly narrow path.
So process is important. But process serves an outcome, at least in my view. You don't put a process in place for nothing. You've got some clear objective that you're trying to target. But the point is, your point is very well taken. If the process does not support an effective implementation that gets you to an outcome, you have failed. All right? It's nice to say here are the goals, but unless you have in place a structure that enables the implementation of a plan to get to that, you just can't get there. So it is important. It requires some transparency on the part of the multiple parties that tend to come together to play, to get to an outcome, and to work through processes. I'm reminded by your question of the point that Susan made, which is maybe we're too focused on transactions and not enough on relationships. So I thought that statement was a very powerful statement about a change in mindset that is moving us from just a set of things that we're trying to do to a more sort of a stronger relationship that enables then the enterprise to actually move forward. So that certainly is something that I think we can't forget.
Chris, I guess I would suggest that there's a third piece that you maybe left out, and that's institutions. Because if you look at the K through 12 debate, it was largely a debate about inputs, more money, and now it's a debate about outputs. And you can, not being a K through 12 expert, but certainly people criticize No Child Left Behind for making the entire system test-driven and relatively mundane. So there's a problem with doing that. To me, the more interesting question, in fact, another report we have coming out on this, on how you would, written by a couple of really great education experts who started the charter school movement, the guy Ted Coldery in this country. And what Ted has come up, in his view, is the charter school movement has failed, or it certainly hasn't succeeded, because it didn't change what went on inside this classroom. So I think if you start to think about institutions and processes and say, we generally, from an inductive point of view, we generally know what the right thing is. We've talked about that today. We talked about that that we think relationships are a key part of that. We think bridging institutions are a key part. That's really what the Focus Center program is about, a bridging institution. We kind of have a good sense, I think, of institutionally the sorts of things we ought to be doing, but we're not doing them very much. We're doing them little bits, but not enough. So I think that's a third piece of this that we need to be thinking. If we moved in that direction, I think we would have a better sense that we would be getting the kind of outcomes we wanted.
Bill? No.
I have nothing to add to.
Okay, thank you. I think we should turn to the audience, and the first hand I saw was Demos on the left aisle over here, right aisle.
Well, first of all, thank you all for really a great summary, and I think you've put all of this into perspective quite nicely. I'd like to maybe add to another piece around this issue of relationships and the sense of risk. I think we've talked a lot of different programs, and certainly from the perspective of many of us who are trying to implement things, the tolerance for risk, the tolerance for really taking, and trying new things, being able to go beyond some of the institutional boundaries is still not very high. Certainly we're looking at things such as innovation hubs, focus centers, as you've called them, Rob, but many of the pieces of legislation, some of the restrictions make it hard for us to take the risks I think we would all like to take that will allow us to do things in a much more powerful way. Maybe you might be able to address, what do you think is risk a big deal? What is the tolerance for it? And do we think we need anything to enable us to take greater risk? We see many specific issues, indemnification, IP. There are many issues we're struggling with where risk, I think, is inhibiting the ability to do something that's bigger than what we can do right now.
I'll just respond real quickly, which I think is a big, broad generalization. I think the U.S. biggest problem is it's a failure of institutional innovation and imagination. I think that's where we're failing. Other countries are taking risks all the time, and they'll try something, and we're so afraid of trying anything different in this country, whether it's Democrat or Republican. I think the related part of that is if government starts taking risks and they start failing, are they doing a bad thing or a good thing? Because if they're not taking risks, then they're not doing a good job, and if they start to fail. So I think we've got to recalibrate what we think about the role of government, and that it inherently means taking risks, and it inherently means failure, and it shouldn't be, past a certain point, I guess you're failing on everything. There's some sweet spot in the middle there, and I don't think we're anywhere near that sweet spot right now.
I remember testifying before Congress some years ago that if they were funding programs of industry-university collaboration, and every program succeeded, they should fire the program manager because, and this was sort of a shocking notion, frankly, to even the House Science Committee, which is where I was talking about this. Sort of the notion that it would be okay and routine to have built in a certain amount of failure into federal programs. It's, it's too attractive to hold a hearing and do an expose on a failed project. But you ought to have some, or you're actually funding the wrong things.
That's very interesting because I have observed in other forums that in fact one of the advantages that the U.S. has in innovation is that it is okay to fail. That is, the social cost of failure, particularly in the Far East, but even in England and even in Europe, is much higher than it is here. Now, you're arguing that this is institutional risk averseness as opposed to individual. And I'm not, that might be right. I just don't have an image of whether the European institutions are less risk averse than ours.
Yeah, I mean, I think this notion of risk is a fractal phenomena that is exhibited both in the government but also increasingly, perhaps, all the way down to the researcher, driven probably by the institutions and the government, quite frankly. But I'll just give you an example, and this is, we need to struggle with this one because our government needs to help us and embrace risk. Otherwise, we will not see the risk-taking out of the performing institutions, be it industry, be it labs, be it universities. When we were about to engage a supplier for lithography equipment in this large EUVL DOE program, turned out the best supplier was in Europe. And yet there was an incredible reluctance on the part of the U.S. government to allow any kind of an engagement with a non-U.S. supplier, in spite of the fact that the U.S. Manufacturer of ICs was the end beneficiary by this. And there was a clear business model for it, but the government just couldn't understand it. It was just sort of foreign. So we've got to get our government to the place, if we're using them to incentivize through funding both universities and labs and maybe perhaps the industry differently, the government needs to be able to accept some risk and realize that this is such a fast-moving global arena that some different things are going to be tried. And by the way, those are probably okay. All right. So I think it's a significant issue. You know, if we use the government as an incentivizer through funding, along with that can't come a bunch of rules and regulations that actually handcuff us rather than free us and allow us to really be as creative as we can be.
I think, Kent, you had a question in the back.
Two quick questions. Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. As I listened to the panels today, I frequently heard, and certainly in the last panel, extolling roadmaps. Other panels would talk about the need for a strategy or for a plan. Yet this kind of thing seems to be noticeably absent in the U.S. approach to innovation. And second, going back to rising above the gathering storm, there were two clear goals that were articulated before they got to the specifics of improving STEM education and increasing R&D funding. And one of the two was high-paying jobs in the United States. It really goes back to that earlier question of what kind of payoff is there for the taxpayer in the country from the enormous amount of money that flows into the R&D enterprise.
I didn't hear the question.
Was there a question there?
We weren't sure what the question is. Everyone agrees with you.
Well, and going back to the Council on Competitiveness also called for a strategy. How can we move toward having a national strategy for innovation? And second, if you look at the jobs question, won't you have the S&T community going beyond questions that we usually talk about to focusing on what happens in the classroom, or perhaps the current account and trade deficit, or the lack of the safety net? The S&T community, I think, by and large, is absent from those discussions. Can they keep that absence and move in the direction that they want to move?
Anyone? Let me suggest, in part, to your question, Ken, about whether there are, where is this sort of strategic direction planning, use the word, so I'll use it here, the P word, in our system. In part, it is, it seems to me, an institutional question, as Rob has suggested. If you decided you wanted to do one of these plans, we go back to the semiconductor industry roadmap, which had its origins in part in national legislation. Around that same time, there was an aerospace industry's roadmap. There have been a chemical industry roadmap. But there's no natural home for these things. And one of the virtues of another idea that Rob Atkinson had put on the agenda a few months ago of a National Technology Foundation, it gives you a place to have the discussion. It's Clubhouse then, a place to go where people can break bread together and discover mutual interest. Now that Clubhouse metaphor may actually be part of why we don't do this, because who's in the club and so on. But it's an institutional failure. We sort of decided as a society, as a political society, about 2 decades ago, that creating institutions was not a solution to anybody's problem. And I think we've about played that one out. That, in fact, we've got some gaps and holes in our institutional frameworks that really we could stand. I mean, if we'd said the same thing in 1939, we would not have built Los Alamos, Sandia, Livermore, Argonne, Fermi, Oak Ridge. We wouldn't have the great array of DOE and DOD laboratories we have today. So we've got to be creative about institutions. That may be part of the answer.
I guess, Ken, I would argue our fundamental problem is that we still think of ourselves as immune to competition, and that we're sort of this behemoth that's rolling along and nothing is going to happen to us. And I think, as you heard from Dan, states don't think that way. States know there are these little teeny players. It's sort of like that P&G slide where the world's real big and P&G's a little thing. That's how most of the people in the world think of themselves, most countries. They think of themselves as market takers, price takers, not price makers. And we still think of ourselves as a price maker. Korea, Japan, Canada, they all have national technology and innovation strategies. There's also different models of how you put them together, but they bring together leaders, they institutionalize some sort of advisory body, they have analytical staff support, and they think about this stuff. We are the only country in the world that doesn't do that because we don't really think that we're in competition with anybody. And I think until we start thinking like we're a big state, which we really are now in essence because the world is so globalized, we're not going to be able to do it. So, I think Michael Porter, as much as I think Michael Porter doesn't go far enough, at least he did have that piece on the cover of Business Week, does the U.S. need a national economic strategy? And he answered it in the affirmative, so I think he's right.
Let's see, the gentleman in the dark shirt, sort of, thank you.
Yeah, Miro Kovacevic from Española, New Mexico. We are moved to town. We are now not think tank. We are group think destroyers, I think. I'm macroeconomist, ecological economist. I would like to ask whether we are just addressing the right side of the brain issues here. In other words, whether only endless growth and accelerated growth is the only validated model for innovation. What about if we have reached some limit to growth? Whether then solving the things with cooperation more than competition is more appropriate model. And question of national state jurisdiction versus global jurisdiction, which puts us right now into trouble. So in other words, whether we have poets, prophets, and pinpricks added to the debate. So whether that would be a good way to address something outside of the box ahead of a curve, because I'm submitting to your consideration that we are headed to a very, very strong hyperinflation 3 years out. How do you deal with hyperinflation, not deflation, right now that dollar is being destroyed? So therefore, how do you fund your national labs and all of that, which is different than just technical, so, technicalities versus humanities, fundamentally. So
let's try to take an answer to that simple, straightforward question.
If you've read the German ideology by Marx, you remember a famous line in there that says, "In the morning I'll be a sheep herder, and in the afternoon something else, and in the evening I'll be an art critic." I think one of the goals of having a more wealthy and prosperous society is it gives people the ability to do that. So I would definitely not give up on growth. We can channel growth into a lot of different areas. The Europeans channel their growth into more leisure time. They've taken a lot of that in the last. They used to have the same vacations we did right after World War II, and now they're up to about 5. Personally, I'd rather live in Europe. But the only way you get that is you have to have growth. So I don't think that we can give up on growth. I think growth at the end of the day and innovation are the only. The idea somehow that we could solve global warming without radical innovation, to me, is just it doesn't make sense. Last point would be if what you're also saying is other people than scientists play a critical role, I 100% agree with that. And we did an event with Nesta a while back, which was alluded to today. National Endowment for Science, Technology, and the Arts, I think, in the UK. They've got a wonderful vision of innovation that does include the arts and other things, and I think we need to do that as well. So I agree that innovation is not just about an engineer doing something.
Maybe we take one or two quick questions. I think, David, you had...
So first, one quick point picking up on what Kent said. I think one concern in these meetings is it sounds like if we get innovation right, every other problem will go away, including problems that are fairly directly related to it, like having jobs here. And it's sort of the flip side of the science ghetto problem is sort of, since we're the only ones talking to each other, we might as well solve everything. And so I think it's just sort of a caution at the end of the day. It's not a question or unless someone actually has an answer to that. The question is narrower. We've talked about partnerships and all the other goals as if they're all consistent. And one concern is, how do you get partnerships in a way that continues to have a broad enough agenda? Because the purpose of partnerships from a policy point of view is not to help the companies or the universities, it's to help the country, right? So if one of the concerns is that companies are looking at narrower and more short-term research, even when they go outside. And we want them to partner more so that becomes more of the university and national lab agenda also, and it's tied to relatively short-term agendas of incumbent players. Presumably that can contradict some of the goals that are underlying here about innovation. So obviously it's not either or, but how do you make sure that as you move to more partnerships, you don't actually, back to the what question, you don't actually distort or skew the research agenda in a way that's actually not what you're intending to do when you embrace partnerships as a institutional policy?
Dick Sire was president of Carnegie Mellon when I was there. He was an economist, wonderful guy, who wrote a very interesting paper about this topic. This was back in the early 70s, mid-70s, and there was a lot of concern being expressed about the notion of industrial funding of research at universities at all. And the concern was that it would drive the research agenda at universities to ever more applied, ever shorter term kinds of things. And Dick basically argued, don't worry about it. Because academic university researchers are just no damn good at that kind of research. Okay? They don't understand the customer. Okay? They don't understand what the value metrics are on products. And so industry will learn very quickly that that's not what they want out of academic researchers. And I think that has pretty much played out. We may see it play out again, but just remember, they're no damn good at it.
Maybe we'll take one last question from the Baker Center, from Bob Sheldon.
Thank you. This relates, I won't use the term techno-nationalism again, but it has to do with international relationships. And it was touched on just briefly, and everyone agrees there needs to be partnerships. And we had some very interesting models. The SRC model, we focus on the technology. We don't worry about who the partnership's with. We had the Taiwan model where, in fact, they're encouraging international partnerships. And I'm wondering if the panel would put, and the labs know all about as pointed out, the labs know all about the international restrictions. And I'm wondering how the panel feels about these partnerships. Are there restrictions? Do we go with the maximum innovation with whatever partner? Or do we try to define what an American company is, which no longer is really possible? Are there any restrictions on these partnerships that you want to encourage?
I would err on the side of expansivity, that is, engaging globally, recognizing that there's probably some governor on that. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think if we try to put too much constraint on that early on and go in that direction, we're going to lose out, I think, significantly. There's so much happening globally that we need to stay abreast of and harvest for our own advantage, and that interaction helps the global partners as well. I would still err on making the bubble bigger rather than trying to put too many controls on it.
I think the Procter & Gamble analysis of that is also apropos at the national level. Now,
yeah.
That we have so much more now to learn from outside than we have to give away from inside. that we ought to really be focused like a laser beam outside. And that's one way that we get to do it.
And I guess I would, sort of building on that, Chris, what we learned from Procter & Gamble, and I've heard it from other companies as well, as you open up, your core staff become more creative. So it's really, how do you sharpen the saw internally, and you do that largely, or one way to do that is by further engagement.
Let me give Rob the last word on this.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. I thought the most interesting point of the panel that I was on, or chaired, or moderated, was when John Z., I don't remember his last name, when he said, when I asked him, well, if you came back to your board and you said all of your innovations were produced outside the U.S., would that be a good thing? And he acknowledged it wouldn't be a good thing. The Taiwanese see globalization as a global engagement as a means to an end. The end is still techno-nationalism. They'll tell you, they're not shy about saying that, nor are the Germans. And I think if we have to have that same discussion. Is globalization good for us? That's the question. And I think one difference between us and Taiwan is, difference is that they have about 12 million people and we have about 300 million people. And so we have a lot more opportunities to do innovation here. We don't need to go outside. I mean, I've been meeting with the Finns. They have this wonderful thing, organization called TechS. If we had TechS in the U.S., it's a tech transfer organization, and we invested what they invest in it, we'd be investing $33 billion a year. Now, they have offices in Silicon Valley. They have them in Germany. They have them all over the world, and they're totally outward-looking focused because the Finnish market is 7 million people. They get that. We're a little different, so I think we can't just sort of blithely go down that path. Having said that, I do agree that Chris, I agree with your point, too, on all of this, that we can't have the same old totally inward-looking focus anymore. The world is too big. But I think we can't just at the same time go to the other extreme and say, oh, yeah, anywhere it's commercialized in the world, it doesn't matter to us.
No.
I know you're not saying that, but I think we just have to balance that, and part of it is on a project-by-project basis.
Well, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the audience for remaining with us, and I guess someone Alan, will you be calling us to a close here?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you, panel. Thanks to all the speakers and moderators. On behalf of the organizers of the event, you have our sincere gratitude. Now, outside here, we have a reception that's being presented by Oak Ridge and Sandia, by Scott Campbell and Baker Donaldson, the Baker Center, and the Wilson Center. So with that, it has to be fantastic with all those sponsors. So please do stay around and join us. Look forward to talking to you more. Thank you.